Well, here we are with another backstory, and what a backstory this is. A book that's like none I've ever read. I don't know whether Paul Verhoeven would think much of that. Good evening, Paul. How are you?
Hello? No, that's the highest of compliments. It should be like any other book. I have ADHD, so it's like 9 books crammed into one book, I
Yeah, I
think.
was going to go with that. It struck me at first that lots of people might not go on about ADHD, but obviously with you, it's very much to the fore. It's coursed your life, no
Mm.
doubt, and everything is through that focus. And I thought for a moment, how do you tell if someone's got ADHD? They'll tell you, and they'll tell you.
Yeah,
It's not like that because you actually I don't think I've ever come across that sort of scenario before. But it
yeah.
is important. It's the whole point of the book in a way. As a reader, I read it and thought, well, that's obviously a major part of the book. And this is a backstory. And I'll probably say from the beginning, it's not for the faint-hearted, the book. It's done with humour, but it's not. You wouldn't get your 12-year-old daughter to read it, I'd suggest.
No, but that does happen. So we do the live shows of Loose Units, and we have kids rocking up. I mean, not children. I mean,
Yeah,
no child
no,
is that small.
that's
But there's not Lilliputian. But we have I think we had an 11-year-old rock up with her mum, and she was hard as nails. This 11-year-old had seen some stuff. She was like Dickensian, like really just proper, like a chimney sweep. And she was among the least offended by things. So I think maybe the people we have to worry about are maybe people who are 70 up,
Yeah, I don't think offence is the word. You just got to be. Nowadays, you'd have to have a trigger warning. I think the term is you'd have to have a trigger. We've leapt into this as if everybody knows what the books are about. But maybe you could give us a background to the 2 books that we'll be talking about tonight.
Sure. So my dad was a cop in the 1980s in Sydney, which is, I mean, he referred to it as the Wild West of policing. There were no horses. That's a disappointment. But basically, he was like a 21-year-old with a gun, engaged in car chases, fighting crime. And I don't know about you, but when I was 21, I was functionally useless. And when I was, I think, 7 years old, I stumbled into his old case files. This is after he'd retired from the police force, mind you. He kept these boxes full of case files with big glossy photographs and police journals, and I almost said evidence, but I think that's illegal. So let's say there was no evidence in the box.
No evidence.
No evidence at all. And I started having recurring nightmares because of these crime scene photos that I had kind of literally fallen headfirst into. And so I think back in 2017, I approached Penguin Publishing and said I would like to write a Princess Bride style, true crime-ish, father-son, black comedy, road movie style, just mishmash of genres about the things that my dad lived through when he was on the force in the 80s in Sydney. And they said yes, thank God, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And I wrote a book called Loose Units about Dad's cases. Now, when the book was finished, we had all these other cases left to go, and he had plenty of fuel left in the tank. So my wife Tegan came up with the idea of doing a weekly podcast. And then the podcast sort of exploded, and we did live shows, and we toured, and we did this thing for about 1.5 years. And then I contacted Penguin and said, I'd like to write a sequel, because after Dad finished up in uniform, he was in forensics. Now, forensics is basically, imagine CSI in the 80s in Australia. So lots of linen, lots of sleeves rolled up, lots of men at work playing. And so Electric Blue, that's the second book. That's a book based on Dad's time working, fingerprints, autopsies, stepping under the police tape at the grisliest crime scenes and just sort of dealing with that. But the reason I mentioned Princess Bride is because, as you mentioned earlier, the books are also about, my relationship with Dad, the differences between us, the kind of adventure that we had on the fringes of going through his old case files. So yeah, it's sort of a bunch of genres and a bunch of stories intermingling. And yeah, the second book's been out about 9-10 weeks now, and I'm still not over the smell. If you've never picked up a book you published and smelled it, it's like a childhood dream. It's really nice.
Well, thankfully I have, but it struck me as an amazingly interwoven book, because you're sort of coursing through your youth, your father's younger days, your present day, your father's present day, and in the middle of it, your mum appears too, because They were a good couple, weren't they?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting this, but I mean, I always knew that mum and dad were both cops. Mum and dad met on the force, and part of Loose Units was a sort of unfolding love story about how they met and how they had me. I mean, he proposed after they were together for 2 weeks, which is way, way too fast. It's just, he really needed to slow his roll, but it all worked out quite well, obviously. But yeah, about halfway through the process of writing Electric Blue, I was over in Sydney and mum had a few drinks and we kind of nudged her and all these incredible cases spilled out. It turns out that she was one of the first women to wear uniform in the New South Wales Police Force. She was a member of Romeo's squad who dealt with pretty intense sexual crimes. And she had all these incredible stories about being just this absolute pioneer. And so I went back to Penguin and said, I would like to put a few of her cases smack bang in the middle of Electric Blue. And that's what I did. And it's really interesting how different people tell stories in a different way. I mean, Electric Blue is, it's partly fictional, but it was nice having a completely fresh character to kind of, a springboard off. And mum's reaction when I told her that I was really impressed by the time, she was involved in rushing a man with a shotgun, she said, it's just, don't make a fuss. It's no big deal. Whereas dad would milk that for 10 chapters worth of stories. They're very different people, is what I'm trying to say.
But your father sort of pursued her from afar. Was it a pursuit or was it just chance, do you think?
I haven't been able to get to the bottom of that because I think it's like a background pursuit. When you set a computer to do a virus scan, it's not, you're not actively scanning things, but there is a background process where it's just sort of sifting through ambiently. I think what happened was North Sydney Police Station, where dad was based, was a fairly small place. And it was pure coincidence, pure happenstance that mum was based there as well. And I didn't know this about the police force, but it's like bog standard retail shift work. It's not like in the movies where you get a partner and the two of you coast perilously towards retirement and then your partner dies 2 days shy of retirement and you have to go on a revenge quest. It's not like that. It's like shift work. You check the roster and you just go, I'm with Joe tonight. Damn it, I don't like him. So because mum was at the same station, eventually they were going to be rostered on together. And I don't want to blow this for readers, but I think it's worth pointing out that dad had reached the end of his tether. He was, I think, 19 years old, maybe 20. And he was involved in, he was a toolmaker by trade. And he was an apprentice and he was hiding in the toilets because he was miserable. And as if blown there by the lips of God, I don't know if God has lips, but let's say he or she does.
You have to assume.
Yeah, I mean, that's an assumption. I mean, this is a whole weird conversation. We can have this later, theological/biological. But this newspaper advert literally blows under the door and it's a recruitment ad for the New South Wales Police Force. And on it is a very picturesque young officer. And dad thought, well, that's kind of as good a motive as any, right? So he thought, she's very attractive. I've been looking for something to do and I have a thirst for justice. So he kind of balled those up and went and enrolled. And then at the academy, he sees this woman running around and he's like, that's her. That's the woman from the ad. And they sort of kept bumping into each other. But the thing I like about her cases in Electric Blue is he's not involved. It's not stories about him pursuing her. It's stories about her on her own, having to contend with this insanely misogynistic police force. And I didn't realize, even little things, like they didn't have their own bathrooms. They had to, share the men's bathrooms. And like they were given little feminine batons so as not to offend the delicate sensibilities of criminals. The stuff she had to deal with was just crazy,
Yeah, but she was a bit of a pioneer. You've alluded to that earlier, but she was a pioneer. She was pretty early into the police force, wasn't she, for a female?
Yeah. So up to that point, they were basically ornamental. They would go to kind of schools and they would do community outreach, basically. And I think they reached a certain point in the 80s where PR was not looking good for the police force. And they went, you know what, we really need to soften our image. And one way we could do it would be to have women actually participate in actual policing, not just symbolic policing. So they have this sort of intake of officers, and mum was among the first to do this. And so she got stationed in North Sydney Police Station and she was given a gun, which had one bullet less than the men's guns, which makes no sense. If you think they're weaker as a sex, give them more bullets. Give them a Gatling gun. Give them a bazooka. Don't give them a petite Derringer, which has less bullets. It's Mum's telling me this stuff, and she's three sheets to the wind at this point, and I'm like, how have you not told me this before? And the answer, of course, is she's not a show-off. She's not like Dad. She's not wired that way. I had to wring these stories out of her. We made her come to one of our live shows once. She came to a live show that Dad and I did at Giant Dwarf Theatre in Sydney. And she sat in the audience. No one knew who she was at that point. No one knew what she looked like. And she sat there and she was looking around the audience, listening to people kind of talking about Dad and I and gushing and watching the applause happen. And after that point, I like to think she got a wee bit jealous. She'd never admit to it, but I like to think she got a little bit, she was like, why don't I get this level of acclaim? So now she's got fans. Like, there are people who really adore her work and really appreciate what she did. And she's had women from the New South Wales Police Force reach out to us and kind of go, thank you for telling these stories, you know?
Well, that's why I brought it up, because there's a danger of her being swallowed up with all of your outgoing father. Now, let's go back to before book one. How did this come about that you'd come up with the idea for this book? How did it eventuate? It's an unusual book, but it's got well, it is unusual because it's written by you, and it's also because it's a backstory within a backstory, and it's so many things intertwined in it. So how did it come up, and how did you sort of put the idea to your dad?
So I kept having recurring nightmares as a result of so I saw this crime scene photo as a kid from this case, and I would occasionally hear Dad kind of telling this story to dinner parties full of, like horrified people as I was a kid. And I kept catching kind of key words, and I gathered that it was about a witch, which didn't really make sense. I was like, witches aren't real. So I kept having these recurring nightmares for years and years and years, and I had to see a child therapist because of these recurring nightmares. I was having night terrors, and I reached this weird tipping point about 3 years ago where I was, in my 30s, and my career had stalled a little bit. I'd finished this stint at Triple J, and I'd done years of kids TV, and I was just like, I didn't know what to do next, and I'd always wanted to publish a book. And I was looking across at Dad and kind of lining up all these hyper-masculine career goals he'd achieved. He was a cop, he was a firefighter, he was in forensics, he was one of the heads of security at the Opera House, he was a skydiver, he was a scuba diver, he was like this action man superhero character. And I was a freelance games journalist, wearing my pajamas during the day. I felt like I wasn't measuring up, and the nightmares had returned. And a friend of mine said, are you going to pitch anything at Penguin? Because I'd always wanted to write a book. And I just finished rereading the Heartbeat series. So yeah, there was a very, very soapy 60s British show based on actual books written by an actual cop. And I thought, Dad's never going to write these books. And the thing I like about based on a true story as a kind of like an umbrella term is that you can take true things and you can play with them and wrestle them down and reform them and use them as the bones to build this weird kind of like monstrous thing on. So I thought, what if I took the Princess Bride, the structure of the Princess Bride, where you snap between the bedroom where the grandfather is telling stories to his rapt grandson, and basically build that around true crime. So I sat down with Penguin before I asked Dad for permission. I had this really beautiful, tight kind of pitch planned up, but I realized I'd forgotten to ask Dad. And Penguin they were well up for it. They thought it was a great idea, which I didn't expect. I pitched a whole bunch of stuff, and secretly Loose Units was the one I really wanted. And I then called Dad on the way out and I said, hey, Dad, I kind of pitched a book at Penguin, and I think they might say yes. And he's like, great, that's great. And I said, I think it's kind of about you. And he's like, oh yeah, sure, great. And then he said something really scary. He said, I don't think there's enough for a book. And I was like, oh God, what have I done? I haven't thought this through, because he kept talking up his accomplishments. So I just assumed he would have a book's worth of material. And then they said yes on Monday. This is a Friday pitch, by the way. They said yes on Monday. They sent me this offer. And I had this terrible sinking feeling because of Dad's weird phone call. He just didn't think there was enough. And so we're sitting there having a few drinks at a pub with I'm recording into my iPhone. And he just wouldn't stop talking. And the stories they were just an absolute mess, but they wouldn't stop coming out of him. And I kept kind of taking furious notes. And I have this almost fractal map of the structure of the first book, where I was building this kind of present day meta narrative around cases that he, did. And I was rearranging things on butcher's paper, and I was going really, really hard on this. And about 3 or 4 sessions in, I realized there was way too much for a book. But throughout the process of doing Loose Units, I learned how my dad became a cop. I learned how he met mum. I learned why I was so messed up. And I learned that I wasn't quite as inadequate as I always assumed. So in a way, it's kind of like origin. It's just a nesting doll of origin stories, really.
Oh no, it is different, and I probably won't mention that again because I keep mentioning it. But it is a different. It's very readable, despite the content. Because as you say, your dad went into forensics, and despite what we see on the television, I'm sure it's not quite as sort of swept over. I mean, he went into some pretty gory scenes, didn't he? Do you think it affected him? He sort of pretended it didn't, but do you think it affected him?
So one of the core conceits of Electric Blue is that I think it did and he thinks it didn't.
Right.
And we regularly get people reaching out to us from the emergency services, and we get like people from the military, ambulance officers, morgue workers, paramedics, police, you name it. People reach out and just start telling us these horror stories because they didn't know they were allowed to talk about this stuff. And by allowed, I mean, I don't think they thought it was okay to admit that this stuff had affected them. So when Electric Blue came up, partway through the research process, Dad told me this story about this time where I'm pretty sure he experienced what I would comfortably admit is PTSD. I think he had PTSD. And he kept fighting that idea throughout the process of the book. And I kind of ambushed him with a few kind of revelations about himself. And I talked to mum and got her to corroborate some stuff. I think he's a little bit rattled by it. Our latest season of Loose Units is called Dead Serious. And it's all about Dad's time running a funeral home. Now, yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention mum and dad ran a funeral home. Like just this whole chapter of their lives where it was like, oh yeah, sorry, we were basically living 6 feet under. It was crazy. And about 3 episodes in to Dead Serious, Dad's father died. My grandfather died. And it was a long time coming, but it was so insane to have this guy who prides himself on not cracking get on the mic and talk about his dad's funeral. And then we did the book launch for Electric Blue, and Kumi Taguchi from the ABC hosted it, and it was on Zoom, and it was beautiful, big, boozy, fun, hundreds of people, really great night. And then Kumi made the mistake, maybe not mistake, maybe she knew what she was doing. She asked him about how he felt about his father passing away because her father had passed away, and he cracked. And what I saw in that moment was about 30 years of emotional baggage just like crush him, and he had to like literally leave. He just left the room. And mum had to come in and sit down and go, hi guys, so John's having a bit of a moment, so let's just sort of fill for a bit. And I think the books have sort of become this weird form of therapy for him because he reads them back and he's not reading exactly the things that happened. He's reading my version of things that happened. And in my version, he's a superhero. In my version, he has martial arts prowess. Like he scissor kicks a guy off a moving motorcycle. And the best thing about that for Dad is when he remembers it back, he's now infusing his memories with the version of him that exists in the books, which is like that's an utterly insane thing to do. Like it's just, Dad, you can't fight people like that. There's full blown, I really did take some liberties, and it's a beautiful way to remember him by, like, it's a beautiful way to kind of infuse truth with fiction. And it's a really fun way to write a book. But I'm worried that now Dad thinks that's how it happened. I'm worried he thinks he can like walk into a crime scene and turn into Sherlock Holmes. He was a forensics assistant. I have to keep checking his ego at the door. But I think what's happened is now he's going to look back on these memories and he's going to go, oh yeah, I had a positive impact. I made my son proud. I saved people's lives, and I became a character in a series of books. And I think now, only now, 38 years after he was a cop, that he's been able to kind of purge this from his system. Now, I don't necessarily think everyone who's gone through this should have a series of books written about them because it's very hard work, but it definitely helped.
Did he read back your drafts, and did he make you change things, or did he let you have a free reign?
No. Because I mean, the thing is, like, I once I once compared it to, you know, when you photocopy a photocopy and then you photocopy that photocopy. Do that 50 times and you have something that resembles the original but is basically unreadable. It's not quite that, but Dad would read. I mean, Dad didn't read Electric Blue until it was published. Like, he had such trust in me that he was like, you know what, just take whatever liberties you want, have fun with it. I trust you. The cases that came from my mouth exist on the podcast, so listeners know the kind of the boilerplate raw ingredients version. But what you cook with it is up to you. Now, there is a point about 100 pages short of the end of Electric Blue where things go really weird, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There's an aggressive genre shift, and I took serious liberties. Dad was calling me like almost page by page as he was reading that part of the book, and he was just gasping and laughing. And I think it must be really nice to do stuff, forget about it for many decades, and then have someone kind of play around with it and show you their version of events, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, because I suppose we could all have that happen to when you're in your whatever age your father is now. You'll be looking back at this time, and maybe any offspring or friends you may have will remind you of the time when you were doing something, and you can laugh, and it was all great back then.
Yeah.
It's pretty. So in the first book you touched on, as you mentioned, you touched on his time in uniform. Was he actively craving to get out of uniform, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think he always wanted to be okay. The thing I realized is that Dad and I have a lot more in common than I thought. I am all about the cool perks that you get when you do a thing, right? Like I mentioned before, the smell of the book. That is a weird thing that I wanted. I wanted a launch party. I wanted to see the cool cover art. I wanted a cover quote. Dad, when he was a cop, he wanted to do things like he wanted to step under the police tape. He wanted to have one of those cool holsters. You know, like the gun, like the detective wears when he's leaning over a table and the cigarette smoke off. He's like, talk, damn it, talk. He wanted that. He wanted the plain clothes stuff. He wanted to build a look. He wanted to be out of uniform. So I think, but he also wanted to solve the really tough cases. He wanted to get to, because you have to do a lot of grunt work, a lot of, you know, parking tickets and, you know, traffic infringements and just boring paperwork. But when you get to forensics, or when you're a detective, or when you're in the air wing, you specialize, you get to do the cool thing that you joined up for. And I think Dad's first instinct was, yeah, I want to help people. But after a while, I think he realized that what he actually wanted to do was the really cool, challenging stuff. And if you look through Loose Units or listen to the podcast, you'll find that one of the reasons I think he made such a good cop was that he actively sought out the most challenging cases. And the things that kind of, you know, the really creative, weird stuff. And that's hard to do because when you're in uniform, you find something insane and then you literally have to hand it off to forensics or detectives or whatever. You have to call it in. And some of my favorite chapters in Loose Units are Dad and his partner, who at the time was primarily a guy called Julian. Not his actual name. He had to change his name to protect his identity. But basically him and Julian would like actively pursue the most bonkers cases. And even then, I think he was projecting forward and sort of starting to kind of, you know, when you get impatient, you start doing the stuff you're not meant to yet. He was basically acting like a detective or acting like a forensics expert before he actually was allowed to. And that's why it was nice to do Electric Blue, because he was finally, after 2 or 3 years, able to do what he, I think, actually signed up for.
Yeah, and he took a bit of a turn, and he had an option to go into. I'm telling your story for you, but he had an option to go into detective. But by a chance, he ended up in forensics, which is an interesting area to take. And he found himself in the team with a very good mentor, by the sound of it. Does he talk fondly of his mentor?
So Dad's hunt for a mentor was kind of a weird through line of Loose Units. There's a whole bunch of people he was partnered with. Again, he assumed that you would get a mentor and that would be your guy, right? That would be your person who looked out for you and fostered you. You know, the Gandalf to your Frodo, the Dumbledore to your Harry. You would have this wizened, wise mentor figure. So Dad got to forensics and he thought, finally, I get a mentor. And then he starts, I can't believe I'm going to tell you this. And then he starts telling me all these amazing stories and all these cases. And he can't remember who he was taught by. He just can't recall the specific lessons. He remembers the lessons that were imparted to him. He just doesn't remember who taught them to him. He doesn't remember big slabs of dialogue, doesn't remember all these things. He remembers the details of the cases, but he blanks out the people. It's almost like when you go to a tool rack and there's those silhouettes of hammers and you're like, well, look, I know a hammer went there, but there's nothing there now. So I say to Dad, I'm going to have to make up a mentor for you, or mentors. I have to have someone tell you these things that you got told, but there's no one there. And he's like, yeah, do whatever you want. And I'm a very big Doctor Who fan. And so I just kind of took John Pertwee, his third Doctor, and just sort of put him in there and thought, you know what, just as an experiment, I'm going to have him tell Dad these things he was told and just see how it goes. And after a few chapters, I was like, oh my God, I think Dad's being taught how to be a forensics expert by the Doctor, or the Doctor in a weird mix of the Doctor and Doc Emmett Brown from Back to the Future. And it was working. And when I gave it to Dad, he didn't question it. He did that thing where he slotted this character into his memories and it just sort of worked. And there was this, I was reading something by Neil Gaiman, and Neil Gaiman said, a thing doesn't have to have happened to be true. Because it feels true. And there's a whole bunch of weird liberties I took in these books. And then we've had people from this era reach back and go, that seems about right. But the thing is, I had to invent a character whole cloth. So I just had fun with it. And now Dad, again, is starting to think this guy is real because he occupies a real place and he's saying things that were said in a roundabout way. And part of the reason the ADHD is such an important through line in the book is because my creativity stems from my ADHD, and that's how I communicate with Dad, and that's how I tell stories. So I'm telling a story about getting distracted and making stuff up to make things more interesting for myself. And in that story, I make up a character to make things more interesting for Dad. I give Dad a mentor who I think he would have benefited from in the past. And Dad got teary talking about this character as if he was real. So I guess long story short is, there's no long story short. It's a long story.
It's a long story. Now, your dad seems to have taken to the forensic. I mean, it's not for everybody. Obviously, we're talking about getting to some pretty grisly, there's no other word for them, pretty unpleasant scenes. And he seemed to take to it. Did you get the impression he was a natural for it, or does he learn?
I think he likes puzzles. I think he likes problems. And the trickier they are, the better they are. And I think there's this sort of bittersweet kind of guilt payoff reward thing going on with forensics or any kind of crime solving, in that when you solve a really intense, horrifying puzzle, a puzzle literally made up from the ruination of other people's lives, and there's countless of those cases in Electric Blue, you feel gratification because you've solved a high stakes problem, potentially even caught a killer. You are making big things happen. But the cost at which you got to solve that problem is a loss of life. Oftentimes a very gory loss of life. I think Dad really enjoyed solving the puzzles, but it wasn't until we started talking through the cases 37 odd years later that he began to really feel the cost of those problems. But I think part of the reason he was able to kind of compartmentalize a little bit was because he was young. I mean, when you're in your 20s, you feel invincible. You feel like you can do anything. I still marvel at the fact that Dad was in his mid-20s and was seeing these things, because I was like a marshmallow at 25. I still am. I couldn't deal with any of that stuff. I asked Dad recently whether he would be willing to potentially re-enroll and whether he thinks he could process that stuff recently. And he told me this story. Mum and Dad own a house in Thailand, and they were in Thailand about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And there was a motorcycle accident by the side of the road. And rather than charge into the fray and try and solve it and save the life of the person, Dad called emergency services and did what he could, but Dad felt sick the entire time. I think you reach a sort of limit. At the beginning, the novelty is probably enough to kind of cut through the horror. And then after a while, once it becomes rote, once it becomes routine, and I think this is what happened to Dad, you really do reach a point where it's poisoning you and you need to get out. So I think, in short, for a while, Dad really enjoyed it and was really good at it. And then he reached the tipping point and he had to bail as quickly as possible.
He did get out, and then if you can take it through his sort of career move, you have sort of moved on. You've mentioned the funeral home, but he sort of aimed to get away from that field for a while, didn't he? From the death and destruction. What path did he take?
Somewhat idiotically, he. So this isn't any of the books or the podcast, but after the police force, he was briefly involved and employed as a safety inspector and involved in industrial accidents. I don't know why he did this. It was for a few years. And then he became a firefighter. At some point in there, he had his private investigator's license and he was a PI very briefly. What's odd is, and there's a few chapters of this in Electric Blue, every time he tried to find something different, he kept getting pulled back towards death and mayhem. And this is really, I mean, he was an antiques dealer whilst he was working as a firefighter. And then whilst he was a firefighter, he answered a help wanted ad in the papers for cleaning cars. And then he went to the address in the ad and he found that he was going to be cleaning hearses at Kinsella Funeral Homes. And then because he's a show-off, he mentioned where he'd worked, and Barry Kinsella, the owner, pulled him into this cool room, pulled out a body and said, all right, if you're really an ex-cop, then, what do you think of this? And Dad, because he was a forensics expert, sort of snapped into work mode and started noting all the lividity and the kind of, how long she'd been dead and what was under her fingernails, and accidentally kind of got a promotion to senior guy. And before he knew it, was just straight back, knee deep in death. And you talk to Dad and he's not a cheerful guy, but he's pretty whimsical. I mean, he does not act like someone who has been face to face with this stuff. And I don't know how he sort of kept falling into these grisly jobs. But what's happened now is he's back at it again, because every week and every book, we're just talking about all this terrible stuff he saw. I don't know if he'll ever escape it, because now he's going to be, a production company has bought the rights to Loose Units as a TV show. And so now it's going to be a TV show. There's going to be an actor playing Dad, present day. So there's going to be an actor playing old man, 60-year-old Dad, and young whippersnapper, 21-year-old Dad. And suddenly there's going to be people growing up watching Dad. There's always going to be a John Verhoeven or a character based on him enduring these horrors. Always. He's never going to be able to escape this. And I'm going to keep writing these books as long as I can. So...
Oh, no, that's fantastic. Is that generally known that there's a TV series coming, or is that pretty... Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it's been mentioned a bit. There's a whole bunch of odd projects that keep coming out of this. I love working with Dad. We have kind of a Loose Units Electric Blue umbrella. And one of the sad things about lockdown is we haven't been able to do live shows. But the podcast keeps happening. We'll be doing 2 episodes a week. I've got my plans drawn up for book 3. I've got a really stupid pun-based title, and Electric Blue has been out not that long, actually. And events like this are just so nice, because I was hoping to do the kind of, the literary festival circuit in person, but I get to do it in my house. And I'm not even wearing pants right now. The things you can do from lockdown, it's miraculous.
I know, pajamas are a wonderful comfort for when you're doing it. Yeah, it's just that kind of thing. Now, with that in mind, you mentioned you've got a 3rd book on the go, and is there plenty of material? And what sort of angle is it going to take? Or you've got it sworn to silence, presumably, are you?
Oh, look, I can show you how the sausage is made a little bit. So the first book happened because I had a really strong structure for a book. The podcast was cases that wouldn't fit, and then we did a season based on the forensics years. So Electric Blue is me taking those cases which have actually been on the podcast and just really breaking them down and building them into something else. Now, if you follow the chronology of the podcast, the next thing is the fire brigade, right? It's Dad's time as a ladder driver in the fire brigade. But the problem is he was a funeral home director at the same time. So I'm sitting here going, do I do more police stuff? Do I do the fire brigade? Do I do the funeral home? Do I do all of it at once? Do I try and get him to finally tell me what he was doing when he had a PI license for those 3 months that he just want to talk about? Or do I get him to finally tell the cases that he refuses to tell because he says that it will put his life in danger? Do I get him to go on the road with me and try and track down his partner who went missing? There's all these insane ideas that I have bubbling under the surface, and Dad's game for all of them, but he kind of doesn't have to be, because he's not involved in the books. He just comes to the launch and reads the book and goes, "Oh yeah, that seems about right." I mean, I love working with Dad. I would do anything with him. I would write a cookbook with Dad if I could. We've really grown a lot closer during this process. So Penguin knows roughly what I want to do. They're really intrigued. I've got ideas for a couple of weird spin-offs. I mean, I'm sitting there. Every time I go to a bookstore, I mean, I look at this. I look at the authors who have a bunch of books, and I go, "Wouldn't it be nice to have just a whole bunch of books?" You know, I mean, not just because of ego, but because I love going through like collections of books, and I love going, "Oh, there's another one to read in the series. I would like to make a series out of this," and I'm primed. Like I'm good to go. So. Yeah.
Just think in a positive way, people in the future will be able to pick up book 1 and read through to book 11 in a way that we can't now. You know, I always thought that you mentioned Harry Potter earlier, and I read those as they came out, even though I was far too old to do it. But now anyone picking them up can read them all the way through and get the whole. It's like on Netflix, you just binge read or binge watch. It'll be really good.
Yeah, I really tried to do something with Loose Units and Electric Blue. I tried to write a book for people who don't typically read books. Because of the ADHD, I have trouble focusing, and I think Dad might have a touch of it as well. And he just doesn't read. He's read like 3 books in his life. And I wanted to structure the book so that people who don't read big, weighty books could read a book that I hope is pretty smart, but at a speed, at a clip, which would make them feel smart. I don't like books that make you feel stupid because you're struggling. Every book I've read can be inhaled like confectionery. It's like fast food, I think, but it's like fast food made with really good ingredients by a Michelin chef. You know what I mean? Like it's a hamburger. Loose Units and Electric Blue are greasy hamburgers. But if you look, it's like Wagyu beef and it's marbled, and it's like I think that's maybe what I've done. And if I ever lose that, if the book series ever loses that, I think that's when I'll stop.
Well, the bite size is a good analogy because there's lots of small stories that are tied together in a way that I'm sure only you could, because it's uniquely driven, I would say, which is both a compliment and a reflection on the way you write things. But it is very readable, and you probably could, because it's going back, so you could hop in any point. If you're in the waiting room and there's the well-thumbed, often read copy of Electric Blue, you'd be able to just pick it up and read one of the stories and say, "Whoa, I want to see the whole of that book."
Oh, bless you. I mean, the only thing I've ever done in these books that requires and indeed rewards attention to detail is the final hunk of Electric Blue. Now, I know I'm being cryptic, but let me tell you something. That was like a dream come true, that bit. I mean, I went to Penguin and pitched Electric Blue. And then the first thing I wrote was this last section. And then I gave it to Penguin and said, "Look, I really hope you don't say no to this because it's a massive gambit." And they said yes, and they let me illustrate it, which was crazy. And it's Dad's favorite part of the book, because can you imagine being a character in a it's so hard to talk about without spoiling. I mean, I think I really
Don't do it. Don't do it. Make people buy your book.
I mean, I think maybe here's what's interesting about ADHD, sorry. You have to weaponize it. You have to trick your brain into being obsessed with the thing that you actually have to do for work. It's like, rather than trying to force my brain to focus on the things and work with the things, I had to, because we have a thing called hyperfocus, which is where you get momentarily fixated on things. And it's really tricky to kind of game the system. I think that's why Dad was such a good cop. And he was so good at forensics. I think he started to really he went through phases where he was really obsessed with the thing. And I think forensics has all these fiddly little like ADHD things. You have the fingerprints and you have all these little systems. It's very system based. And you got your little fingerprint brush and it's very precise. And you get the cool clothes. With me, I had to basically find a genre that I was obsessed with. And then the second I got really obsessed, write that book. I wrote this book very fast. The editing process was nightmarishly long. The research period was huge, but the writing process was like a shotgun going off. It was quick. And it had to be, because otherwise I'd get bored. And that's just the way my brain works.
The way you describe the way your brain works, and I'm trying to visualize it without knowing, how your brain works, and you've done it very well. But I sort of imagine it was like the term herding cats almost. Like you've got all these things, all these various thought processes running off, and you've just got to focus on one. Is that how it is? I just can't. I'm no doctor or anything, but it just seems like you've got to really pin down that element that you want to trace. Otherwise, your head goes in very different directions.
I've talked to friends who are teachers, kindergarten teachers, and I think it's like trying to get a bunch of kindergarten age children to pay attention. You have to make them think it was their idea in the first place. You're going to lose some. Not all of them are going to pay attention. You want to try and get most of them paying attention and clapping along, right? But you need some, like a lot of the kids who are going to really deliver, the real heavy hitters, are the ones who they're smart and they need to be tricked. It's weird having to trick your own brain. I wish I had a brain that just kind of did what I wanted. But if I did, I don't think I could have written this book, because the book is it's weaponized madness, I think. And I've sort of managed to harness it and not stymie it. Like there are bits of my brain that I had to that were stragglers and I had to wait to catch up. And, God bless my editor. He's the most patient man in the world.
I would think so.
Really patient. But at the same time, he really enjoyed the process, because he is a non-fiction editor. A non-fiction editor editing a book based on true events with genre shifts in illustrations and weird time jumps. And I don't think he's ever had that much fun in his life. I mean, he was just wrapped. He was so happy to be doing something different. And hopefully that's what readers get out of this. Hopefully readers pick these up and just go like, what am I even? Oh, okay, I get it.
Now I've had a bit of a thought here. Why? I'm sure you thought of it yourself. Are you going to pitch yourself to play your father in the TV?
Well, there were some jokes about that. But then, of course, what would have happened is I would have been kissing an actress playing my mum, which would have been weird, right?
Yeah, but it's not your mum. It's someone playing you.
Doesn't matter. They're playing my mum. They are symbolically my mum on screen. It would have been weird. And then we talked about, okay, do I play myself present day? Or do we get a Hemsworth? I mean, I happen to know.
I can see the likeness.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, one of the Hemsworths, I won't say which one, is a fan of the series. I mean, there's Russell Crowe was joking about wanting to play Dad. I mean, there's weird casting stuff going on. But honestly, you can picture whoever you want. I would love to play me, obviously, but that's the ego talking. I don't think I could do the me I wrote justice. I think the me I wrote is more interesting than the real me.
Okay, I think leaving lots to be discussed, Paul. I think we're gonna wrap it there, because time has beaten us, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But when next Bendigo Writers Festival happens, you'll come and see us.
Oh, please! I will come with Dad. We'll do a live show. I'll do the Writers Festival. We'll all go out for drinks. It'll be great.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul Verhoeven, and the book's Electric Blue. And Lucy Innes, and thanks very much for joining us. Backstory, and we've had a bit of the backstory, so thank you very much.
Anytime.